Volume 4, Chapter 21, Privateering and the War at Sea. It was clear to all that, militarily, the Americans were most vulnerable at sea, where Britain ruled the waves, and no American population lived to support armed operations. We have seen how Lord Dunmore was able to use the ocean with impunity as his base from which to raid and plunder the American coast, and the entire coastline lay open to raids of this sort. Soon after the outbreak of war, the separate colonies began to try to defend themselves at sea. The first to react was Rhode Island, which chartered 2 vessels in June 1775 to try to save Newport and the coast from the depredations of the British fleet. Massachusetts and Connecticut soon followed with 2 ships each, and in mid-July, Congress correctly, but not very hopefully, urged each colony to defend its coastal areas. It soon became evident that American ships might accomplish more by taking the offensive, particularly in harassing the British supply lines to the Army at Boston. At the end of June, Rhode Island again took the lead. Its radical governor, Nicholas Cook, urged just 1 swift armed ship to seize arms and supplies. Washington took the hint and, despite lack of congressional authorization, appointed shipmaster Nicholas Broughton, a captain in the Army, and presented him with a schooner for that purpose. Broughton's successes led to more of the same, and soon Congress began to give its tentative support. By the end of October, the Continental Fleet consisted of 6 schooners, which acquitted themselves ably against the British. Particularly successful was Captain John Manley of the Lee, who cheered the Americans greatly by capturing several military ships filled with supplies and ammunition. In addition to the schooners, the Americans around Boston organized a fleet of 300 private whaleboats, which conducted guerrilla-type night raids on the British lighthouses and other installations in Boston Harbor. Nettled by his utter inability to cope with the American schooners and night raiders, Admiral Samuel Graves, commander of the British fleet at Boston, decided to punish the Americans collectively in their ports and harbors. In early October 1775, Graves sent out Captain Henry Mowat with 2 schooners and nearly 200 men on a savage terror raid of the coast north of Boston. He was ordered to burn, destroy, and lay waste every seaport town north to Maine, and to destroy all the shipping at their harbors. Specifically, he was to concentrate on burning to the ground the 2 port towns of Gloucester and Falmouth, now Portland, Maine, whose people, according to Admiral Lord Howe, were distinguished for their opposition to government. Finding it impractical to destroy Gloucester, Mowat entered Falmouth on the October 16. Giving the townspeople 1 day to evacuate, he shelled and fired the town until its over 200 houses, 11 ships, and wharves and warehouses were completely burned. The wanton destruction of Falmouth spurred Congress into action. By December, prodded by John Adams, it was ready to create officially a small Marine Corps and a Continental Fleet of 4 vessels, to name its officers and to establish for its supervision what would become the Marine Committee. As Commodore and commander of the little fleet, Congress selected the veteran General Isaac Hopkins, until then head of the armed forces of Rhode Island. By the following spring, the Continental Navy was ready for offensive exploits in the British West Indies. Commodore Hopkins' first operation was to raid Nassau on March 3, 1776, and to seize large stores of British gunpowder. Bermuda also proved a good source of enemy powder. Such large-scale raids were exceptions, however, and usually the tiny Continental Navy was confined to forays by individual ships. As we have seen in the case of the whaleboats around Boston, the great many privateers were far more important than the governmental fleet. As their name implies, these ships were wholly private in ownership and operation. An old tradition of private armed merchantmen preying on enemy shipping during wars, privateering had reached a peak during the 18th century, and in America particularly during the 7 Years' War. As the Revolutionary War began, many hundreds of ships took to seizing supplies and arms by capturing British vessels. New England, particularly Massachusetts, its fishing and carrying trades ruined by the war and by British control of the northern fishing banks, was an especially successful center of privateering, as were Philadelphia and Baltimore. The inlet of Little Egg Harbor on the New Jersey coast was a particularly attractive haven for privateer vessels. Privateering flourished especially during 1775 and 1776, and it has been estimated that as many as 2,000 ships sailed against the British. During 1776, half the Jamaica fleet was captured by American privateers, along with large quantities of ammunition and military supplies. In that year, the British lost several hundred vessels to privateers, with ships and cargo worth over £1 million sterling, a figure exclusive of government transports and storeships. Privateering was not only a very effective means of naval warfare, it was a far less costly and a far more libertarian method than building a government navy. Reliance on privateers saved enormous sums and the time necessary to build new ships, since existing merchant ships were used. Moreover, it saved the taxpayers, including inflation payers, the expense of construction and operation. As in all private operations, the costs were borne only by those who assumed the risks, and their rewards were strictly proportionate to their successes. And the war effort also benefited pari passu with the successes of the privateers. Even Washington saw this, and when he created his small fleet in the autumn of 1775, he tried to approximate privateering conditions by granting to the seamen on each ship 1/3 to 1/2 of the proceeds from the vessels they captured, about the same incentive pay received by the crews of privateers. Not the least important advantage of privateers was the fact that they automatically disappear with the arrival of peace and convert to peaceful uses. The public would not then be saddled with the burdens, bureaucracy, potential tyranny, and the nuclei for the fomenting of future wars that are inherent in a governmental navy. Where in all this was the vaunted British Navy? Fortunately for the American cause, the overconfident British did not bother to launch a serious naval effort against the rebels, and no attempt was made to blockade the American coast. In these critical first years of the war, only a few British warships were stationed in American waters, and the British did not bother to provide armed convoys to their merchant shipping on the Atlantic. During 1775, the privateers proceeded happily, even though unauthorized by the governmental authority. In November, Massachusetts authorized the issue of official letters of marque and reprisal to privateers, and other colonies followed suit. The harsh British Prohibitory Act of late December 1775, denouncing the Americans as traitors and rebels, prohibiting all ships from trading with any part of the 13 colonies, and subjecting all American and foreign ships trading with them to seizure and confiscation, became known to the Americans by the end of February 1776. The Prohibitory Act spurred the Continental Congress to take further bold measures against Great Britain. In March, Congress officially authorized privateers, providing them with continental letters of marque and reprisal.